This is BBC Radio 4. Now it's time for Archive on 4. 70 years ago, the paediatrician and psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott walked into a BBC radio studio in London to record the first of a series of talks that would radically change the way mothers thought about their babies. The 50 or so broadcasts on a wide range of subjects, from breastfeeding to jealousy and stealing, turned him into a household name and the term the good enough mother into a catchphrase. In From Donald Winnicott to the Naughty Step, Anne Karp assesses the man and his legacy through his pioneering broadcasts.
This is Donald Winnicott of London. The following talks were given around about the year 1949 over the BBC under the heading The Ordinary Devoted Mother and Her Baby. The producer was Miss Isa Benzie. The first talk I called A Man Looks at Motherhood.
And that man's look at motherhood was one of the most influential series of radio talks about raising children ever broadcast. From 1943 until the early 1960s, Donald Woods Winnicott gave over 50 scripted talks on BBC Radio. They covered a wide range of subjects, from guilt and jealousy to evacuation and weaning. Before the war, Winnicott was virtually unknown outside paediatric and psychoanalytic circles, but by the end of the war, these broadcasts had turned him into a public figure, and at least one of the phrases that he coined, the good enough mother, is still widely used today.
I shall be deliberately trying to put into words what a mother does when she is ordinarily and quite simply devoted to her baby.
Most of Winnicott's talks were published in 1964 in a book called The Child, the Family and the Outside World. It became an immediate bestseller, and it's still selling healthily despite the abundance of childcare manuals and online advice available. Half a century later, Winnicott still has important things to tell us about the crucial early relationship between a mother and her child.
We still have much to learn about infants at the beginning, and only mothers can tell us what we want to know.
Donald Winnicott was one of the first doctors to appreciate the enormous skill involved in looking after a newborn baby. He thought society undervalued the mother's role, and that contributed to a fear of women. If this attitude remains rare among men today, think how progressive it must have been in the 1940s. Almost all the tapes of Winnicott's broadcasts were destroyed by the BBC. That's what happened to most recordings at the time. But he persuaded them to let him have a copy of one series. He also re-recorded The Ordinary Devoted Mother and Her Baby, his landmark 1949 series, for a New Zealand parenting organisation. We've hunted down those records, so what you're about to hear in this programme are clips from the surviving original broadcasts and from the LPs, neither of which have been heard over the airwaves for over 60 years.
I want you to know that this man, nicely detached from real life, free from the noise and smell and responsibility of childcare, does know that a mother of a baby is tasting real things, and that she would not miss the experience for worlds.
Winnicott hated the idea of giving advice. He thought that parenting by the book, or by the wireless, made mothers lose their own sense of what was right for their child.
If we understand each other thus far, you will perhaps let me talk about being an ordinary devoted mother, and about the management of the earliest stages of the life of a new human being. I cannot tell you exactly what to do, but I can talk about what it all means.
I think the most important thing to say about him was that not only was he a psychoanalyst, he was a paediatrician, a trained paediatrician, and a child psychiatrist.
Leslie Caldwell, who's been co-editing Winnicott's collected works.
He trained in the 30s and became an adult analyst in 1934, and he then went on training and became a child analyst in 1935, and he was the first male child analyst trained in Britain.
I have been wondering how to start to describe babies as persons. It is easy to see that when food goes into the baby, it's digested, and some of it is distributed round the body and used for growth. Some of it stored as energy, and some of it is got rid of in one way or another. That is looking at the baby with an interest in bodies. But if we look at the same baby being interested in the person that's there, we can see easily that there is an imaginative feeding experience as well as the bodily one. The imaginative experience is based on the physical one.
Winnicott himself brought this paediatrics background and the interest as a doctor to his psychoanalytic work, and I think in many respects pushed the notions of how we're to understand the child from a psychological point of view as well as a bodily and physiological point of view in a way that no other psychoanalyst had. Psychoanalysis was always part of his brief and something that he was completely dedicated to. But as well as that, he was always, I think, distinctively a medical doctor and committed also to the notion of what physical medicine could offer. So in some kind of way, you have with Winnicott both the idea of the body as important and needing to be taken seriously in bodily complaints, but also the part that the mind has to play, potentially, in organising those or influencing them or producing them.
So here is a 10-month-old baby boy. This boy is sitting on his mother's knee while the mother is talking to me. He's lively and awake and naturally interested in things. Instead of just letting everything get into a muddle, I place an attractive object on the corner of the table between where I'm sitting and where the mother's sitting. The mother and I can go on talking, but out of the corner of one eye, I can watch the baby. You may be sure that if he is just an ordinary baby, he will notice the attractive object. Let's call it a spoon, and he'll reach for it. As a matter of fact, probably as soon as he's reached for it, he will suddenly become overcome with reserve. It is as if he thought, I better think this thing out. I wonder what mother's feelings will be on this subject. I better hold back till I know. So he turns away from the spoon as if nothing were further from his thoughts. In a few moments, however, he will return to his interest in the spoon, and he will very tentatively put a finger on it. He may perhaps grasp it and look at mother to see what he can get from her eyes.
What he noticed and what he remarked on constantly in his early papers in particular, but then right through his life,
Historian Sally Alexander,
was the wisdom that mothers brought, the insights. He learnt observation, really, from watching them and listening to them and listening to the ways in which they described their children. In his early papers, one of the things that he said was that children were brought to the clinic, to an open clinic, by their mothers or their parents, with a whole cluster of common symptoms, which in everyday language would be fidgetiness or bedwetting or whatever. And if you listened to the mother describe their symptoms and tell the story of their symptoms in their own words, the story that unfolded would give the doctor an indication and an insight into the state of mind of the child and to the anxieties and psychological disturbances that were maybe provoking those symptoms. So he learned from mothers, but he didn't idealise them.
I'm used to having mothers bring their children to me, and when this happens, we see what we want to talk about right before our eyes. The child is jumping about on the mother's knee, reaching out for things on my desk, climbing down onto the floor and crawling round, clambering up on the chairs, pulling books out of bookcases. Or perhaps clinging to mother in dread of the white-coated doctor who will surely be a monster who eats children if they're nice, and who does worse things if they're nasty.
Winnicott understood listeners. He was extraordinarily sensitive to different audiences and the different ways they needed to be addressed. His frequent letters to medical journals were controversial. In 1939, for instance, he wrote a letter to the British Medical Journal, along with John Bowlby and Emmanuel Miller, the father of Jonathan Miller, in which he decried the evacuation of children under the age of 5. But over the radio, he tried to avoid controversy and felt that he should focus on the ordinary devoted mother rather than the less devoted kind. He loved the provocative epigram, though. He once wrote on the inside of a notebook, "Oh God, may I be alive when I die." He would dream up playful catchphrases that expressed complex thoughts in an accessible way. Psychotherapist and author Naomi Stadlen.
Well, he's mentioned it in various pieces of his writing, that once at a meeting at the Tavistock Clinic, people were talking about the baby, and he obviously got furious and he finally burst out, "There is no such thing as a baby." And he said everyone turned around to stare at him. But what he meant was that if you are talking about a baby, you're finding that you're talking about a baby and someone. And he wrote, "A baby cannot exist alone, but is essentially part of a relationship." That's really well said.
The only true basis for a relation of a child to mother and father and to other children and eventually to society is the first successful relationship between the mother and baby, between two people, with not even a regular feeding rule coming between them, nor even a rule that baby must be breastfed. In human affairs, the more complex can only develop out of the more simple.
I was inspired by some of the things he said.
Naomi Stadlen.
Especially the way he described a mother picking her baby up and how she'd get her arms under the baby and kind of get the baby together and get the baby's cooperation before lifting the baby up. I'm sure nobody has described that before because I've looked, and I don't think people have taken much account of it after, but lifting up and putting down is a major part of looking after a baby. And it was brilliant of him to have seen that that was important.
Winnicott's vision was microscopic. He was alert to the tiny signals exchanged between a parent and their infant, the meaning of a baby's drool, for instance, or a mother's drifting hand. And yet he had no children himself.
I know a young mother who made a very early contact with her baby boy, her first child. From the day of his birth, after each feed, he was put in a cradle and left by his mother's bed by the sensible matron of the nursing home. For a while he would lie awake in the quiet of the room, and the mother would put down her hand to him, and before he was a week old, he began to catch hold of her fingers and to look up in her direction. This intimate relationship continued without interruption and developed, and I believe it has helped to lay the foundation for this child's personality and for what we call his emotional development and his capacity to withstand the frustrations and shocks that sooner or later came his way. He's now left school, and he's really done awfully well.
He's sometimes linked in people's minds with John Bowlby in that both were believers in attachment and attachment parenting. How distinct do you think their beliefs were?
Well, I read a lot of Winnicott, and of course I think they're very distinct. I mean, Bowlby's ideas came from animal psychology. Winnicott's came from observation of mothers and children, of listening to mothers and children. And then there's another thing about Winnicott's thought, which was very distinctive, which was that in the end he thought everyone was alone, and that even the mother, even the fetus inside the mother's body was isolated and separated from the mother. There was no metaphysical attachment or physical attachment between mother and child. You're always an isolate. That's his term. So I think they're very different.
Even in the womb, your baby is a human being, unlike any other human being. And by the time he's born, he will have had quite a lot of experience, unpleasant as well as pleasant. It is, of course, easy to read into the face of newborn babies things that are not there. though to be sure a baby may look very wise at times, even philosophical. But if I were you, I shouldn't wait until the psychologists have decided how human a baby is at birth. I should just go right ahead and get to know the little boy or girl, and let him get to know you.
His sensitivity was the result of long clinical practice, but it was also nurtured by two pioneering BBC producers, Janet Quigley and Isa Benzie. Quigley and Benzie together moulded him into a brilliant broadcaster. Both of them fell upon any bits of Winnicott's scripts that might produce guilt in listening mothers. And Winnicott was always keen to improve as a broadcaster. Over and over again he invited them to suggest changes to his scripts, and they obliged. Sometimes he even incorporated their suggestions into his talks word for word. It was Benzie, in fact, who came up with the title of his most famous series, The Ordinary Devoted Mother and Her Baby. Another producer, Sally Thompson, remembers working with him on a series called Parents and Children in the 1960s.
My memory is that he was quite small and had greyish-whitish hair when I knew him, and ever so slightly bent. He always seemed to be a very nice man, a very sweet-natured man, quite shy, really, not particularly forthcoming, except when required to speak.
What was it like producing him?
It was a delight, because he was such a nice man.
Winnicott had a brilliant feel for language. He couldn't have been more different from the psychologist John Bowlby in this respect. Benzie kept having to remind Bowlby to use words of one syllable, and to make his points through pictures and examples and concrete nouns. Winnicott, on the other hand, had an intuitive sense of when and how he could convey his meaning best by using metaphor or an evocative turn of phrase.
I can't help being reminded of a theatre agency which advertises with the following slogan: "You want the best seats, we have them." This always makes me madly jealous, so that I feel like rushing off to get the seats that I want and they have. The snag is that I have to pay for them. Using this as an illustration, I can say that up to a certain age, a little boy or girl is all the time proclaiming, "I have the best mother," only not in those words. Eventually the moment comes when the child would proclaim, "I have the best mother, you want her." This is a painful new development.
Winnicott couldn't abide the sound of his own voice. He broadcast anonymously, as all doctors did at the time, and listeners were told that he was a psychologist or a doctor caring for children. His voice was so high-pitched that many listeners thought he was a woman. Sally Thompson again.
He told me spontaneously, it's not something I would have dared to ask him about, he told me that he had adopted this voice because he took the role of the mother when he was talking to his little patients. And that seemed to be a source of comfort to them, and it certainly helped him in his relationship with them.
But I've got another theory. I think the pitch of his voice helped him communicate well with mothers, too. It made him sound less like a declaiming male pundit who had infallible truths to impart. It's almost as if it positioned him midway between the genders, neither male nor female. Eventually, a clever studio manager thought of moving the microphone closer to him, and he pronounced himself happy with the way he sounded for the very first time.
Babies are not born with an alarm clock hanging around their necks with instructions, "Feed 3 hourly." Regular feeding is a convenience to the mother and to the nurse. And from the baby's point of view, it may well turn out that regular feeding is the next best thing to having a pull whenever the impulse to feed turns up. But a baby doesn't necessarily start off wanting a regular feed. In fact, I think that what an infant expects to find is a breast that comes when it's wanted and disappears when it's not wanted.
Winnicott's talks were also part of a reaction to the punitive child-rearing advice of Frederick Truby King. Truby King commanded mothers to breastfeed by the clock, 4 hourly feeds, with baby left untouched in the fresh air for the long stretches in between. His system produced enormous guilt in those mothers who were unable to stick to it, and also in those who did, even as late as the 1960s. Sally Alexander again.
The rule-driven approach to children, that you waited 4 hours between feeds and you put them out in the fresh air for a certain amount of time every day, and you didn't pick them up if they cried. And I remember my mother insisting that I didn't pick Abigail up. And we both sat there in my bedroom with Abigail in the cot in the next room. I could not stand it after about 10 minutes, and I went in and Abigail's nappy pin was undone and was sticking into her little tummy. So my mother never told me to do that again. So, but I think it was, that you're spoiling this baby, you're going to spoil this baby. And that was very powerful. Winnicott, no, I didn't think I'm not sure that the word spoil entered his vocabulary. I don't remember it.
I urge parents not to be intimidated by the rule that had existed up in pediatrics to that time. You must never feed a baby off schedule, not a minute early, not a minute late. I was one of the first pediatricians to say that's nonsense. That rule made babies cry, but it was even harder on mothers. They bit their nails in anguish, waiting for the clock to say, this is the minute you can feed.
Of course, Winnicott wasn't the only voice urging parents to trust their instincts. That was Dr. Benjamin Spock, whose common sense book of baby and child care, which was first published in 1946, has sold 50 million copies altogether. His liberal advice was the Bible of parents in the 1950s and 60s, my own included. Sally Alexander.
Well, I think Spock's book, his famous Mother and Child book, is much more practical, really concrete advice about how to feed, how to change nappies. Whether he consciously got it from Winnicott or whether it was just part of the atmosphere of paediatrics and informed by psychoanalysis post-Second World War in the 1940s and 50s. I remember rushing to Spock at various moments when my first child was very young, and he always made you feel all right about whatever it was you did with them, whether you wrapped them up too tightly or left them out in the pram for too long, or it would be all right. So I think he got that from Winnicott.
Rigid routines have alternated with more liberal parenting advice pretty much ever since. For every parenting guru urging parents to trust their instincts, there's been another encouraging them to get their children into a routine sooner rather than later. Pick up a parenting magazine from 1943 or 2013 and the questions are the same. How often should you feed your baby? Should you always pick them up when they cry? Winnicott's views were never extreme or absolutist. He understood the value of routines, but was wary of them being imposed on parents too early.
If the relationship between mother and baby has started and is developing naturally, then there is no need for feeding techniques and weighings and all sorts of investigations. The two together know just what is right, better than any outsider ever can. In such circumstances, an infant will take the right amount of milk at the right speed and will know when to stop. And in that case, even the baby's digestion and excretions do not have to be watched by outsiders. The whole physical process works just because the emotional relationship is developing naturally. I would even go further and say that a mother in such circumstances can learn about babies from her baby, just as the baby learns about his mother from her.
This was his recurring theme. We tend nowadays to think that it was Freud who first insisted that the baby's early relationship with its mother was formative, but in fact it was Winnicott developing the ideas of the hugely influential psychoanalyst Melanie Klein. And of course Winnicott wasn't the only psychoanalyst to broadcast regularly. There was John Bowlby, and also people like Ruth Thomas and Susan Isaacs. Although they were good communicators, none of them embraced popularising with quite the same gusto and skill as Winnicott, and they just weren't as witty. Winnicott had cut his teeth in the child guidance movement before the Second World War, and the spread of child guidance clinics in the 1930s helped make the British public receptive to his message. But perhaps the most important reason that Britons were ready to hear him was the war. The Second World War shattered the old certainties, even while it heightened the importance of the BBC in British society. The war also removed children from their parents through the evacuation scheme.
We're on number 12 platform at Waterloo Station, one of the 10 big metropolitan stations that are engaged today on the evacuation of London's school children. We're on number 12 platform, the train's in, and the children are just arriving, coming along in their school groups with a banner in front saying what school they are. This lot, St John's School, Walworth, which is south of the river, and then they follow behind. The tiny tots in front, leading up to the bigger ones, the 12, 13-year-olds behind, and here comes a high school, more like 14, 15 and 16. They're being evacuated too.
Evacuation focused people's minds on how the presence of a reliable and attentive mother helped a child develop into a healthy adult. The war also enabled the British public to acknowledge aggressive instincts in infants and not just nations. Winnicott himself certainly identified with babies. He thought they had lions and tigers raging inside them. But he understood too their need to be free of intrusion from parents.
Some children are never allowed, even at earliest infancy, just to lie back and float. They lose a great deal and may altogether miss the feeling that they themselves want to live. It seems to me that if I can convey to you that there really is this living process in the baby, which as a matter of fact it's quite difficult to extinguish, you may be able better to enjoy the care of your baby. Ultimately, life depends less on the will to live than on the fact of breathing.
One of the most striking aspects of Winnicott's broadcasts is the way that he addressed mothers in the second person. It almost sounds as if he's buttonholing us through the direct way he says you.
I think the most important thing is that you easily feel that your baby is worth getting to know as a person and worth getting to know from the earliest possible moment. No one who comes along to give you advice will ever know this as well as you know it yourself.
Winnicott believed in listening to mothers.
There are some people who are rather shocked if they find they can have other than loving feelings towards small children. If you listen to the following conversation, you will find that these mothers happen to be people who are pretty certain about loving. They take it for granted. And they're not shy to talk about the seamy side of home life. These mothers were definitely asked to talk about what they felt was irksome to them. And they found no difficulty, apparently, in responding to the invitation. Here's the beginning.
Mrs. W., how many children have you got, first of all?
I have 7 children.
Ages?
Ranging from 20 to 3.
And do you, in fact, find it rather an irksome job being a mum?
Well, yes, I do, I think, on the whole, if I'm quite truthful.
In what way?
Well, I think the difficulty is really in a family that little annoying things, like the constant untidiness and always chasing about and trying to get into bed, those sort of things I find irksome.
Mrs. A. Well, I've got only 2 children, one a toddler and one a baby. And, of course, it's the poor toddler that irritates me. Like Mrs. W., it is the little things, and also the lack of time.
What struck me was the care and intensity with which he answered these questions.
Sally Thompson again.
He had been answering mothers' questions for years and years, and I don't suppose there were many questions that he encountered that he'd not met before. But he never switched on to automatic. He answered each question with terrific concentration, and you felt that perhaps he thought, maybe some new insight will come to me while I'm talking to this woman, or maybe this woman is different from the last mother who asked me this question, and therefore I have to answer the question differently for her. He was a very sensitive and very kind man, I think.
Anything that takes up the mother's time can bring about jealousy, just as a baby can. I really do believe that children who have met jealousy and come to terms with it are richer for the experience.
Mrs. S., you've got, I know, 8 children.
Yes.
Have any of them been jealous of each other?
2 or 3 of them have. The first baby was 15 months when the second one was born, and I was feeding the baby when he was about 3 weeks old, and the child was stroking his head and saying, "Baba, Baba," so lovingly, and I said, "Yes, isn't he sweet?" And the next minute the voice changed, the expression changed, and he cracked him over the head and said, "Baba!" And I began to think that the child wasn't quite so happy about the baby. And a week later, he was in the pram, sitting not in his usual place, facing the hood, and the baby was in his place. Mm-hmm. And I was getting my hat on to go out, and something made me look out of the window, and the baby was just about to be thrown on the path. Yes. So I switched that around promptly by putting him back in his old place and putting the baby in the handlebar place, and I've done that with them all and found there's no more trouble in the pram.
When he started being an analyst, he'd already been working for 10 years as a paediatrician, listening to mothers and children, paying a great deal of attention to what mothers said. I think his capacity to speak beautifully in ordinary words and language about the mental and the physical health of the infant and the child, but also the relationship between mother and child, and between the child and the father and mother in particular, I think it was unique. It must have been like a breath of fresh air to hear him speaking.
The first talk I called "A Man Looks at Motherhood." To begin with, you will be relieved to know that I'm not going to be telling you what to do.
Winnicott's broadcasts attracted sackfuls of appreciative letters from listeners, many of them asking for advice. Although according to the BBC's Audience Research Department, other listeners dismissed them as Freudian nonsense. In the years since, Winnicott's work has been admired but also criticised. Some psychoanalysts feel that he took altogether too cosy a view of the baby's aggressive feelings towards its mother. Did he idealise mothers? Was he part of a movement to put women back into the home after their wartime employment? And of course there was a central paradox in a male psychoanalyst saying that mothers know best. Naomi Stadlen.
He says, "To begin with, you will be relieved to know that I am not going to be telling you what to do." I don't know how that strikes you, but I thought that he could have put that as a question, like, "I wonder if you'll be relieved to know," or "You may be relieved to know." But instead he says, "You will be relieved to know." So he's getting into an intimate relationship with his audience, the mothers he's talking to, and making an assumption about them. He's assuming right from the very first line that he knows the feelings of the mothers who'll be reading it. He can't really know. He's engaging us in a kind of offer of pretending. So if we go into it and say, "OK, we'll pretend," that's fine. Pretending is fine so long as both parties know they're pretending. But it's very easy just to go past that sentence, as I did. And it's only now, looking back, that I can see that he's actually engaging in an intimate relationship and allowing himself to tell me what I think and what I feel.
I'm a man, and so I can never really know what it is like to see wrapped up over there in the cot a bit of my own self, a bit of me living an independent life, yet at the same time dependent and gradually becoming a person. Only a woman can experience this.
The bit about being wrapped up in a cot, a bit of my own self, he's saying that this is what mothers see. Some mothers do see their babies as a bit of their own self, and some mothers don't. They certainly don't all see babies like that. So Winnicott is assuming to know something he can't possibly know. And about gradually becoming a person. Sheila Kitzinger, the anthropologist and one of the founders of the National Childbirth Trust, said that when her baby was born, her first daughter, the first feeling she had was of startled recognition that this was another person, not a baby as such, but a real person. And I'm sure that Dr. Winnicott would have been interested if he thought of that himself, but somehow he didn't seem to allow for that possibility and didn't seem to have listened to mothers enough to realise that that's what mothers see when they first see their baby.
You knew just how to pick the baby up, how to put the baby down, how to leave well alone, letting the cot act for you. And you had learned how to arrange the clothes for comfort, for preserving the baby's natural warmth. Indeed, you knew all this when you were a little girl and played with dolls. And then there were special times when you did definite things, feeding, bathing, changing napkins and cuddling. Sometimes the urine trickled down your apron and went right through and soaked you as if you yourself had let slip. And you didn't mind. In fact, by these things you could have known that you were a woman and an ordinary devoted mother.
What about stereotyping? Because there are these places in the talks where he talks about little girls playing with dolls, exhibiting the maternal instinct. Do you feel that he did stereotype mothers in that way?
I don't think he did stereotype it. I think he observed and watched little girls play with toys. And I grew up in the 1940s, Anne, and I was a tomboy, and I played with dolls incessantly. And I had 2 sisters, and I was surrounded by my mother and aunts. And I had dolls and dolls' prams, and I wanted babies, and I produced babies, and we acted out births, and we did all sorts of things with our babies and our dolls. And the little boys, my brother sometimes joined in, but mostly didn't. It was what little girls did. So I don't think it was a stereotype. I think it was, again, from observation.
These broadcasts, which lay out very beautifully the way that mothers, by really attending to their children's early needs, enable them to develop into a healthy individual. But the task is so demanding that really it amounts to an ideological push of women back into the home after the war. What do you think of that?
I don't think he did push women back into the home after the war. And the research of historians is that, young women were very mixed themselves about whether to have babies, and they were thrown out of all their employments that they'd taken over during the Second World War, and so on. But I don't think you can hold Winnicott responsible for it. What he did believe, and he believed very strongly, was that prolonged, forced separation between mother and infant in the early years of life was perhaps not a good thing, if it was forced, if it was prolonged. But small children could get used to it and could be led into it. He was a very conservative, with a small c, medical doctor. I don't think he thought, women should all be out being scientists and feminists. He wasn't keen on that idea. He did think young mothers should be young mothers, but he didn't think that attachment meant that women couldn't work or couldn't. For heaven's sake, he worked with, all the women in his professional career, the matrons, his domestic servants to whom he was close, his fellow psychoanalysts, Susan Isaacs and people they worked with, they had children. They were professional women.
Sally Alexander. Winnicott died in 1971, but he stopped broadcasting in the mid-1960s. One reason was his continuing ill health, but another was probably a creeping but profound cultural change. As more women began to enter the workforce and the playgroup movement developed, popular discussion began to focus on the ill effects for both mother and child of mothers isolated in the home with their baby. Yet Winnicott has never stopped being influential.
It isn't that the baby is right. The baby isn't right or wrong. It is that there aren't any rules that apply to everybody.
Penelope Leach, spelling out her ideas on Desert Island Discs.
And the only guidelines you've got is the baby you've got, who's never happened before and will never happen again. And I think the point that people miss is, it isn't that I think you should do this really for babies' sakes, but because if you don't, if you try to follow a set of rules that don't feel comfortable to you, you're going to be miserable. And that's what makes babies miserable.
Welcome to my podcast page at miriamstoppard.com. Here you'll be able to download audio programs containing advice and information on a range of health and wellness issues. I've always aimed to give people...
There are certain parts of his teaching which are deeply embedded in my DNA, and I have written about them in a very similar way to the way he writes. Not that I knew that I was doing that, just that when I reread him, I realised he encapsulated my thoughts and my philosophy so closely, and I thought, all those years ago, in the 60s and early 70s, I must have been reading him and taking him on board, because, you know, some of his publications were around 65, 66. I must have been reading them and taking them on board. I think they're as fresh now as they were when he wrote them. I think they're as useful now as when he wrote them, and I think they're as true now as when he wrote them. If only they could be translated into tabloid speak. I mean, I write for a tabloid newspaper. If I could translate this into that kind of easily reachable language, I think mothers would be wholly reassured to read the theories and the philosophy that he espoused.
I was trying to not give advice, but to try to show what mothers were actually doing and how they felt about what they were doing. I still run a group called Mothers Talking, and I just found I was learning so much from it. And I thought, this isn't in the books at all. I ought to get some of it down. It's just so different from anything that was written about before.
In a way, I think what connects you with Winnicott is that instead of giving advice, it's more a question of trying to identify and name things that mothers do to make them visible in the world. Would you agree?
Completely. I think that one reason why people who are mothers don't realise they're doing anything, and they often say, I got nothing done this morning, is because they can't put a name to all the quite subtle things they were doing. And if they do say they were doing something, it's often in terms of what they can see themselves doing, like clearing up or making breakfast. Whereas actually what they have been doing is, while they were making breakfast, kind of showing their child what they were doing or engaging their child in it. And just doing so much wonderful mothering. It's just incredible. And it's a great pity that there are not enough words for that, because mothers can feel so disheartened when they're just doing the best things they could possibly be doing.
You've been critical of Winnicott because you argued with, I think, some measure of accuracy that he was almost claiming to know what women were feeling. Aren't you running the risk of doing the same yourself?
Well, I was very careful. It was difficult to do, but in the introduction to What Mothers Do, I wrote at the end of it that I hadn't given advice. I was giving description, not prescription. And if anyone could find any advice in it, they could write to me and let me know. So that was in 2004, and I haven't had a single letter. I have to say that mothers are so different from doctors, and I read some of Winnicott's writing out to a group this morning, and mothers just replied in a sort of typically mothery way. They were saying things like, oh yes, it could be, yes, perhaps, oh, I don't know, I don't think my baby's quite like that. So they're sort of deliberating, they're very tentative, they're prepared to kind of consider things. And a typical mother will say, well, I'm only talking from my own experience. They're not dogmatic on the whole. Dogmatic ones are unsure ones, but if they feel safe, they're not dogmatic at all.
Naomi Stadlen. Donald Winnicott has been described as the first English analytic media celebrity, and he was very English. But he broadcast at a time when the sources of information available to parents were limited. Justine Roberts, founder of Mumsnet.
I don't think any of us are trained for parenting, and I think something has happened in the current community that we live in, which is we are very disparate. We don't live cheek by jowl with our aunts and our mother and our sisters. We're very dispersed. People are very busy. They often are isolated from friends who are having children at the same time. But the one thing they do have is access to the internet.
What sort of things do they talk about?
People come to Mumsnet usually when they have a burning issue or a problem. A lot of people come because they're searching for something on Google. We get a lot of people who are pregnant, who have just discovered they're pregnant. In fact, a lot of people who are trying to get pregnant as well. What foods can't eat when I'm pregnant? Or is there anyone else pregnant when I am who I can share kind of the pregnancy with? They might have a burning issue about sleep or eating or a health issue. Or it might be someone simply Googling, how can I stop my washing machine being smelly, which is actually a very common Google search term, and Mumsnet is the number one answer to that. Essentially, Mumsnet is there to make people's lives easier.
What would Winnicott have made of Mumsnet? He most probably would have been delighted to see women taking the job of mothering so seriously and swapping experiences so freely. But he was also highly sensitive to the fact that if you focused on what mothers did wrong rather than right, you could stir up enormous anxiety.
I'm Tracy Jensen. I'm in Media and Cultural Studies at Newcastle University, and my research is on parenting culture, social mobility, and the production of social and cultural value. It creates so many possibilities for the possibility of failing, so much scrutiny, so much surveillance, so much self-surveillance, so much self-monitoring. It's a never-ending process.
And that self-monitoring is the opposite of what Winnicott wanted. So in a way, unself-conscious mothering is almost an impossibility today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Winnicott would have said, just go with it, and if you fail, that's completely fine, you need to do that. And what's interesting about a lot of contemporary parenting advice is that it starts with this position that there's already too much advice, that we're already too anxious about how to parent, and that this book, this programme, is going to be different. It's going to show you what to do, it's going to alleviate those fears, it's going to calm down your anxiety. But of course what it does is just generate more anxiety. Possibility of stepping back and saying, I don't know what to do here, I'm just going to go with my instinct, and if I get it wrong, that's fine. That's kind of unthinkable now in this kind of intensive parenting culture that we live in.
There's infinitely more anxiety.
Dr. Miriam Stoppard again.
Because there's so much spurious information being thrown at them that makes them feel inadequate and insecure and ignorant and frightened. And wherever they turn, they can find this information. You know, you just go onto a website and you click into the comments and away you go. There's just masses of information that will pull you down and is really quite destructive. And you have to be a strong person not to take any notice of that. So I feel parents have it really hard now because they don't know where to turn for reassurance that they're on the right track and what they're doing is okay. They make a few mistakes, of course we all do, and that's normal. But you just have to be a good enough parent. And if you just look at these newspapers about yummy mummies and all that heinous stuff, it's anti-women, actually. It's the anti-women stuff I don't like. And there are websites that specialise in anti-women stuff. So it's very hard for women to have that kind of, the confidence in themselves and also self-respect, because they become demotivated, demoralised, and they don't believe in who they are.
Well, I think what's interesting about Winnicott is that his position was very much that mothers have to fail. They have to be good enough, not perfect. And his position was very much that in not being perfect, mothers set up the conditions for their children to become autonomous, to become independent. So what's interesting for me about him as a kind of a voice in parenting advice is that he's very much kind of against parenting advice, and he's in support of failure. He sees it as a positive thing, which I think is a very powerful message.
Tracy Jensen. How Winnicott would have loathed the way that parents are shamed and humiliated in some modern parenting programmes before the eventual smiles and relief of both parents and child at the end. It sometimes seems as if it's parents and not children who today are being sent to the naughty step. But I can't help feeling that he would have understood the pleasures of schadenfreude often involved in watching these programmes. At least the finger is being pointed at some other poor parent, and not you. The bad enough mother seems to be blamed for almost every modern evil.
The bad enough mother is the mother who can be held outside of ourselves, who we can place all of our anxieties and fears about failing onto. The situation that we're in now is that parenting, more than anything else, is seen to be the cause of and the solution to a whole range of social problems. So things as varied as childhood obesity, educational failure, poor performance at school, whether you get into university or not, whether you go on to become gainfully employed, whether you go on to have a successful relationship as an adult, and also the sort of competence with which you parent your own children is all traced back to the quality of the parenting that you received as a child. And there's been a real kind of intensification of that narrative in recent years, which I think is very much against what Winnicott would be arguing for.
And much more scrutiny of how parents actually parent and mother's mother than in his day.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's an intensive scrutiny upon what mothers do in particular, what parents do more broadly, and a real kind of intensive gaze and attention upon the minutiae of every single parenting decision that you make. Every moment of your parenting life is potentially a moment where you're going to do it wrong. I think it's a very common narrative that we are in a period of parenting crisis, that we've forgotten how to raise our children. And there's a lot of nostalgia tied up with that, the idea that our parents somehow knew how to parent us, that our grandparents knew how to parent them, and that there's this idea that the reason why society is broken, why Britain is broken, is straightforwardly and simplistically connected to this crisis of parenting. And actually, if we look at the empirical evidence around how much time we spend with our children, how attentive we are to their needs, how much energy and time we devote to them, all of that empirical evidence suggests that we have more time for our children, we have more attention to lavish upon them, we're more concerned with them, and that's something that cuts across for all mothers. So I think the idea that we are in crisis is, although it's a very powerful idea, I think it's one that we need to take with a grain of salt.
Some people seem to think of a child as clay in the hands of a potter. They start moulding the infant and feeling responsible for the result. This is surely quite wrong. If this is what you feel, then you will be weighed down with the responsibility which you needn't take at all. If you can accept this idea of a baby as a going concern, you are then free to get a lot of interest out of looking to see what happens in the development of the baby while you're enjoying responding to his or her needs.
Of course, some parents want advice and need help, and Winnicott did see a role for people like himself.
To become a mother, you go through a great deal, and I think that it is because you go through so much that you become able to see with a special clearness certain fundamental principles of infant care, so that it takes years of study for those who are not mothers to get as far in understanding as you may get in the ordinary course of your experience. But you may very well need support from those of us who study you, because superstitions and old wives' tales, some of them quite modern ones, come along and make you doubt your own true feelings.
But he also saw how easy it is to get hooked on experts.
If she is without understanding of the things she does so well, she is without means to defend her position, and only too easily she spoils her job by trying to do what she's told.
Donald Winnicott focused his energies on hymning the hidden work of the ordinary devoted mother and her baby. But he did recognise that mothers could also fail at the job and be less than saintly. He once wrote a paper in which he identified 18 reasons that a mother might hate her baby. I read that paper when I had a small baby, and it freed me to really love mine. Winnicott remains important for us today for many different reasons. In some of the advice dispensed nowadays, children sound less like humans and more like animals. The emphasis is all on training and compliance. You could be mistaken for thinking that they might answer to the name of Rover and wag their tail. But Winnicott never lost sight of the personhood of even a newborn. He encouraged mothers to try and understand their babies, but also to recognise their changing needs as the infant begins to separate and start seeing the mother as existing in her own right rather than just as an extension of the baby itself. Of course, Winnicott wasn't perfect, but he thought analysts should be like mothers. Perhaps he was the good enough psychoanalyst.
The ordinary good mother and father don't want to be worshipped by their children. They endure the extremes of being idealized and being hated, hoping that eventually their children will see them as the ordinary human beings they certainly are.
So, a man largely forgotten by the wider public, who had no children of his own and had a female-sounding voice, but who actually showed more understanding of the minute-by-minute job of mothering than many of the pundits, male or female, sounding off today. Donald Winnicott, the expert who hated giving advice, the man who wanted to listen to women and encouraged women to listen to their babies. What he had to say about parenting all those years ago has lost none of its relevance today.
It's surely tremendously important for a mother to have the experience of doing what she feels like doing, which enables her to discover the fullness of the motherliness in herself. For just as a writer is surprised by the wealth of ideas that turn up when he puts his pen to paper, so the mother is constantly surprised by what she finds in the richness of her minute-to-minute contact with her own baby. One might ask, how can a mother learn about being a mother in any other way than by taking full responsibility?
From Donald Winnicott to The Naughty Step was presented by Anne Karp and produced by Mohini Patel. After the news, we've another dramatisation from our series The Great Scott. David Tennant stars in Waverley, Walter Scott's gripping tale of love, war and divided loyalties.
On BBC Radio 4, Wireless Nights with Jarvis Cocker.
Let's zoom in a little then.
We're looking for foxes tonight, if we can find one or two.
Detecting the after-dark activities of nighttime folk.
Standing and watching them, quite fascinating to see how they work and what they're up to.
4:30 in the morning GMT, it is a danger time.
If one or more of us suspected that we had been followed, we were to be silent and keep walking past each other.
Wireless Nights with Jarvis Cocker returns to BBC Radio 4 on Thursday after dark at 11.
To understand the child from a psychological point of view as well as a bodily and physiological point of view in a way that no other psychoanalyst had. Psychoanalysis was always part of his brief and something that he was completely dedicated to. But as well as that, he was always, I think, distinctively a medical doctor and committed also to the notion of what physical medicine could offer. So in some kind of way, you have with Winnicott both the idea of the body as important and needing to be taken seriously in bodily complaints, but also the part that the mind has to play, potentially, in organising those or influencing them or producing them.
So here is a 10-month-old baby boy. This boy is sitting on his mother's knee while the mother is talking to me. He's lively and awake and naturally interested in things. Instead of just letting everything get into a muddle, I place an attractive object on the corner of the table between where I'm sitting and where the mother's sitting. The mother and I can go on talking, but out of the corner of one eye, I can watch the baby. You may be sure that if he is just an ordinary baby, he will notice the attractive object.
I think the most important thing to say about him was that not only was he a psychoanalyst, he was a paediatrician, a trained paediatrician, and a child psychiatrist.
Leslie Caldwell, who's been co-editing Winnicott's collected works.
He trained in the 30s and became an adult analyst in 1934, and he then went on training and became a child analyst in 1935, and he was the first male child analyst trained in Britain.
I have been wondering how to start to describe babies as persons. It is easy to see that when food goes into the baby, it's digested, and some of it is distributed round the body and used for growth. Some of it stored as energy, and some of it is got rid of in one way or another. That is looking at the baby with an interest in bodies. But if we look at the same baby being interested in the person that's there, we can see easily that there is an imaginative feeding experience as well as the bodily one. The imaginative experience is based on the physical one.
Winnicott himself brought this paediatrics background and the interest as a doctor to his psychoanalytic work, and I think in many respects pushed the notions of how...
Almost all the tapes of Winnicott's broadcasts were destroyed by the BBC. That's what happened to most recordings at the time. But he persuaded them to let him have a copy of one series. He also re-recorded The Ordinary Devoted Mother and Her Baby, his landmark 1949 series, for a New Zealand parenting organisation. We've hunted down those records, so what you're about to hear in this programme are clips from the surviving original broadcasts and from the LPs, neither of which have been heard over the airwaves for over 60 years.
I want you to know that this man, nicely detached from real life, free from the noise and smell and responsibility of child care, does know that a mother of a baby is tasting real things, and that she would not miss the experience for worlds.
Winnicott hated the idea of giving advice. He thought that parenting by the book, or by the wireless, made mothers lose their own sense of what was right for their child.
If we understand each other thus far, you will perhaps let me talk about being an ordinary devoted mother, and about the management of the earliest stages of the life of a new human being. I cannot tell you exactly what to do, but I can talk about what it all means.
BBC Radio. They covered a wide range of subjects, from guilt and jealousy to evacuation and weaning. Before the war, Winnicott was virtually unknown outside paediatric and psychoanalytic circles, but by the end of the war, these broadcasts had turned him into a public figure, and at least one of the phrases that he coined, the good enough mother, is still widely used today.
I shall be deliberately trying to put into words what a mother does when she is ordinarily and quite simply devoted to her baby.
Most of Winnicott's talks were published in 1964 in a book called The Child, the Family and the Outside World. It became an immediate bestseller, and it's still selling healthily despite the abundance of childcare manuals and online advice available. Half a century later, Winnicott still has important things to tell us about the crucial early relationship between a mother and her child.
We still have much to learn about infants at the beginning, and only mothers can tell us what we want to know.
Donald Winnicott was one of the first doctors to appreciate the enormous skill involved in looking after a newborn baby. He thought society undervalued the mother's role, and that contributed to a fear of women. If this attitude remains rare among men today, think how progressive it must have been in the 1940s.
This is BBC Radio 4. Now it's time for Archive on 4. 70 years ago, the paediatrician and psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott walked into a BBC radio studio in London to record the first of a series of talks that would radically change the way mothers thought about their babies. The 50 or so broadcasts on a wide range of subjects, from breastfeeding to jealousy and stealing, turned him into a household name and the term the good enough mother into a catchphrase. In From Donald Winnicott to the Naughty Step, Anne Karp assesses the man and his legacy through his pioneering broadcasts.
This is Donald Winnicott of London. The following talks were given around about the year 1949 over the BBC under the heading The Ordinary Devoted Mother and Her Baby. The producer was Miss Isa Benzie. The first talk I called A Man Looks at Motherhood.
And that man's look at motherhood was one of the most influential series of radio talks about raising children ever broadcast. From 1943 until the early 1960s, Donald Woods Winnicott gave over 50 scripted talks on BBC